Right. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to mention at the outset that we are recording this class and it will be uploaded, so you can refer to it whenever you want to. And in today's class, we are going to be talking about George Bernard Shaw's iconic play, Arms and the Man. Okay. Now, Arms and the Man is an anti-romantic play. Can anybody tell me what the subtitle of the play is?
An anti-romantic comedy in 3 acts.
Yes, an anti-romantic comedy in 3 acts. So the entire title of the play is Arms and the Man, an anti-romantic comedy in 3 acts. Good. So this play was written in 1894, and 4 years later, it was published in a collection of plays, which that is in 1898. The title of the book was Plays Pleasant. Understand? And the thing is, before we move into the play, it's important that we get a bit of context about the play, as well as the entire ideology around which it was structured. See, Shaw did not just randomly write a play where all of these ideals are being crushed. Okay, now this came on the back of a lot of literary discussions and deliberations. First of all, you have to understand the idea of something called the well-made play. The well-made play was, something that was kind of a formula, and it was derived, or it was, let's say, that devised in around 1825 by this French playwright called Eugene Scribe. Okay, Eugene Scribe, and what he did in this particular, formula, so to speak, is that he, kind of devised very stock characters and stock situations, and he would just order these plays around these scenes and these situations around. So a well-made play would be one that is structurally very sound and has its formula all set out or laid out. Understand? So the characters would behave in such a way, there would be a kind of an internal conflict, maybe on account of some misunderstanding, some misunderstood remark, misheard remark, something gone missing, and then it would all move towards a resolution, and finally it would be resolved. In fact, there is Wilkie Collins, who also found this formula to be very convenient. See, if I tell you that you can write a well-made play, and all you have to do is this, what you will do is you will probably set up the scene where there are two houses and there are two young people living in these houses. They love each other, but the thing is that one of them overhears the mother of the other person talk ill about this, so boy, and then is that the boy gets very upset, and he tries to avoid the girl, and then later on it is understood that the lady wasn't talking about this boy, she was talking about some other random boy, and they just happen to have the same name. Then all problems are solved and they unite and they live happily ever after. Understand? See, we have already made a play. Understand? So that is why it's called a well-made play. In fact, Wilkie Collins is supposed to have said that, this is a very convenient formula, because all you need to do is you need to make them laugh, make them weep, and then make them wait. That's it. Okay. So there would be this, essential suspense building, and it was like that. In fact, Eugene Scribe used to write a lot of plays, thanks to a number of assistants. So he would probably give them the outline and say that, okay, now put all of this suspense and tragedy and misunderstanding or something like that, and make me a play. Understand? But the well-made play became very, very popular all over Europe. Now comes a turning point in the form of the problem plays. Okay, now the problem plays were, let's say, plays that tried to use the structure of the well-made play in order to criticize, in order to I suppose, present, okay, very serious social problems. Understand? So, problem plays fundamentally, they came about in the 19th century in order to deal with a lot of social issues, okay, but in a realistic manner. They did not try to sugarcoat it, they did not try to make it fantastic. They just, tried to present it in a very realistic manner, these social evils or social ills and so on, and in order to make the audience think. Okay, so Henrik Ibsen, the Norwegian playwright, was one of the biggest forces who initiated as well as sustained the genre called problem play. Understand? So you have the best example in the form of Doll's House, A Doll's House. Okay, where a woman tries to come out of the shell of protection that has been established for her by her family, and where she has been rendered powerless because of the social structures that were weighing her down. Okay, and in fact, it was in a place like Ibsen's A Doll's House that actually inspired Shaw to write plays. Understand? And write plays of the sort that he finally ended up writing, in particular, like, Mrs. Warren's Profession, which was about prostitution. Okay, Arms and the Man, which tried to de-glorify the concept of war. A lot of plays like that. So that is why we have to understand that Shaw's plays are topical. Understand? They are topical because they discuss the relevant topic of the time. Okay, his plays had more to do with issues rather than with people. See, yesterday we were doing Julius Caesar, right? And in Julius Caesar, you saw, I told you also that more than the situation, what Shakespeare focuses on are the people. Understand? All the people in the play, their individual characteristics, their shades of gray and things like that. But here in Shaw, what he does is that he focuses on the situation, the unique situation in which people find themselves in. And then using that, he tries to let us know more about the situation, not the people. See, in the plays of Shaw, it is not the people who are important. There is, not one outstanding character or anything. What makes the character outstanding is the situation that he finds himself in. Understand? Whereas in Shakespeare, what made his characters outstanding was, their characteristics. Okay, their conversations, their thought processes, their dilemma. Understand? But here it is not the case with Shaw. So that way there is this effective comparison between Shaw and Shakespeare. Okay, and in fact, Shaw has also said that he has tried to, kind of, let's say, break Shakespeare's, the natural history. Understand? He has tried to kind of modify Shakespeare's views, on natural history and present his interpretation of the same. By natural history is meant, the ways in which, history has been presented, the worldviews have been presented, the entire atmosphere and the subject matter and themes have been presented. Okay, so Shaw, what he has done is he has tried to change that. He has tried to bring about a kind of conversation where the situation, okay, the dilemma, the problem at hand is what is paramount, is what is extremely important, as opposed to the characters. The characters are there only to further the plot of the play. Okay, the plot is not there to glorify the characters. That is the difference. So that is what I wanted to tell you about well-made plays, which led to problem plays. And you have Arms and the Man, which was written in 1894, as I mentioned earlier. And the title of the play is taken from Virgil's Aeneid. okay, which begins with the lines of arms and the man I sing. And then, the entire text is actually a glorification of war, of heroes, of their heroic deeds, their bravery, their sacrifice, the loss that is caused, the cataclysmic set of events that come about because a brave warrior has died, things like that. Again, think about what you studied in Julius Caesar last day, where Calpurnia says that, beggars die without making much noise, but the entire nature comes down, the heavens come down to announce the death of a prince. Understand? So it is that kind of romanticism. See, there are characters that were willing to kill themselves to maintain the republic status of Rome. Understand? But and in our modern day ideology also, patriotism is something extremely important. We are supposed to live for our country, we are supposed to die for our country, we are supposed to make considered perfect strangers as enemies for the sake of our country. Okay, and when you fight, you are supposed to show no mercy, because you are supposed to protect your borders. So you're dying for the sake of your nation. There is a reason why on days of national importance, people play these patriotic movies like Roja, Border, and so on. And I suppose in very short time they'll also start playing Uri. There's a reason why they're doing that, because dying for your country is supposed to be the ultimate romantic ideal. Okay. Now, what Shaw does is that he takes the first line of Aeneid, of arms and the man I sing. Okay. He takes arms and the man and he turns it, he de-glamorizes it. He kind of subverts that idea. Understand? He subverts that idea, because what he does is, where Aeneid is a glorification of war, of the deeds of the warriors and so on. Here you have a play that kind of de-glamorizes war, that kind of gives a very human face to soldiers. Understand? Remember what Bluntschli says. He says that you can always make out whether a soldier is an old one or a young one by looking in the insides of his holsters. Right? Because the old ones will be carrying food and the young ones will be carrying, bullets and casings and so on. Understand? So it is that, that when the idealism wears off, when that freshness wears off, then reality starts to set in and people become hardened. And, the ultimate battle is that of survival. Understand? So that is why. And imagine the very fact that Shaw places as one of his central protagonists a mercenary. Understand? A man who fights for money, who has no ideological affiliations. As he tells Raina, I would have joined your army had they come marching through Switzerland first. Understand? So that kind of a thing. And before we finish the lesson, I would like somebody to remind me about the sudden surprise that we find in Bluntschli's character. Please don't forget that. Somebody has to remind me. Right. So, and I hope I haven't mentioned this, but Aeneid was written in the 19th century BC. Okay. So don't just write 19th century. It was 19th century BC. Yeah. So in 19 BC, just keep it that way, 19 BC. So, by the time the first act of the play is done, we are introduced to almost all the principal characters, or at least, we would have heard of them. Understand? And through the description of the stage, through the the very structure of the characters, okay, what Shaw does is that he effectively lets us know what each of these characters is designed to do, what their role in the play is. Understand? So he uses the actors themselves as narrative techniques. Okay, so you have Raina, who stands there soaking in the majestic beauty of the Balkans, the mountains that can be seen in the distance. She's intensely aware of her beauty. See, that beauty is equal to a higher ideal. Understand? Raina's beauty is supposed to contribute to her higher ideal, just as Sergius's beauty is also supposed to contribute to a higher ideal. Okay, and in contrast, you have Bluntschli, who is a man who is not very remarkable looking, who does not have a wonderful nose. He is kind of, middling stature. He has, that's about it, so very unremarkable looking man. Okay, so what Shaw does is that he uses his very characters to further the narrative of his play. Understand? So, if you want to look at the themes of the play, they are pretty, straightforward. In a statement earlier, Shaw had once said that he wanted to celebrate. Marriage, and he also wanted to make it out that war is not a big deal. So he wanted to de-glamorize or de-glorify war and celebrate the idea of marriage. Okay, so he manages to do both. Okay, but at the same time, he did not want to make love into something of an abstraction. See, in a number of films, a number of movies, a number of books, poems, etc., we find that love is made out to be something divine, something beautiful, something out of this world. It is that for which you have to give up, or there'll be people who will oppose, and you have to overcome all of that. Things like that. And love is taken beyond the idea of a certain degree of attraction into something that is spiritual, something that comes from the soul, like that. That is why you have eternal love stories. I don't know how you feel about love stories. They might look pretty interesting to you at this point of time in life. It can look interesting to you at any given point of time in life. See, there is no age for romanticizing romantic love. But it is always good to be in the know of what is what. Understand? So that is quite interesting. So what Shaw does is that he takes his characters and he makes them say those very lines which will defamiliarize the idea of a higher purpose in love for us. Understand? So that is why when Sergius comes and he meets this girl Luca, he looks at her and he says, sometimes I just get tired of all of these pretensions. Understand? And she says, yes, I know, because Mistress Raina also behaves exactly like you. Understand? So and then he gets very angry with her, because she seems to suggest that Raina is two-faced, that she is as duplicitous as he is. Okay, but that remains the truth, that remains the fact. So this aspiration for a higher love, this aspiration for a more spiritual self, all of this is shown as pretension by Shaw, because he does not believe that this is how human nature is. Understand? So we will come to that. First of all, let's take a look at the themes in the order of how they come about. You know, the first theme being idealism versus realism. Understand? Now, idealism here is presented, or is put forward in the characters of Sergius, Raina. Okay, these two people whose ideas of higher love, whose ideas of heroism, whose ideas of beauty and aesthetics have come from all the operas that they've seen in Bucharest, and from the poetry of Byron and Pushkin, so on. So they let's say, imagine a more amorphous kind of idealism. Okay, so that they are right there. But then you have people like Bluntschli, you have Luca, in fact even Nicola and Catherine, who are rooted in realism. Okay, in reality, actually speaking. So their approach to life is way different from this. They are not inspired by let's say opera or poems or beautiful paintings and so on. Okay, their experiences come from the rawness of life. Okay, they are pragmatic. Okay, and they want to be able to survive. Okay, in fact, Nicola takes his pragmatism so far as to willingly, release Luca from all commitments so that she can marry Sergius and then come and buy things from his shop. See, that is why, Luca says, Nicola, you have the soul of a servant. And he says, even if that is the case, Nicola does not mind, because what he is looking for is a time when he, kind of will prosper. Yes. Yes, Catherine supports Raina in the beginning. When it's not about Catherine supporting Raina and Sergius. It is about the no nonsense approach that she takes to some of the practical things around her. Okay, the practical way in which she deals with all the human beings around her. Okay, and she was very, very particular about Sergius, not just because he was handsome and not just because he was betrothed to Raina. It is because he was handsome and extremely rich. Understand? But the minute she realizes that Bluntschli is possibly even richer than Sergius, she just switches her alliance. Okay, it is not because she is a bad person. She just wants to take those decisions that can work best for her. So there is this definitive contrast between realism and idealism. Okay, and realism, in fact, was quite prevalent, quite popular as a movement, as a thought, as an ideology in the time of Shaw. Okay, because realism meant that people wanted to write about or present their views on life without any sugarcoating, without any kind of affectation. Okay, they wanted to present life as it unfolds. They wanted to present dilemma as it presented itself to people in real life. Understand? So that is what it was. And not only that, this play also was crucial because Shaw had this essential idea in life that he wanted to write, or let's say put forward, this is a quote by Shaw, drama that is true to life in parable, not an accurate picture or transcription. So he did not want to copy life word for word. But what he wanted to do was that he wanted to present life in the form of a parable, in the form of a story. So he wanted to present drama that is true to life in parable and not an accurate picture or a transcription. Understand? Now, so realism versus idealism. Okay. Then anti-romanticism. Okay, anti-romanticism, which is present in the very title itself. In fact, the title itself gives you a clue about the kind of play that this is going to be. So Shaw wanted to use this play to gain validity for his views on anti-romanticism. This is why, he shows that Sergius and Raina got their ideas of romance, of higher love, of bravery, patriotism, etc., from the operas of, in Bucharest and the poetry of Pushkin and Byron. And on the other hand, you have Bluntschli, a man who is unremarkable in his appearance, a man, who tries to survive as much as possible, okay, and tries to come out of any difficult situation without any harm or without falling into danger. See, when Sergius finds out about him and Raina, he immediately challenges Bluntschli to a duel. Now, knowing fully well that Bluntschli is just going to walk through the entire duel without being harmed at all, yet he does not participate in the duel because he believes that one must try to live for as long as is possible. Okay, it is one's duty to live as long as possible. That's the entire purpose of being born. But what do we learn? We learn that cowards die many times, but the brave die but once, right? And that is what we think is the ultimate truth of life. But here is a man who comes and tells us, try to live as long as possible. It reminds me of this wonderful line from this novel called Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. It goes something like, Yossarian intended to live forever or die trying. Okay, so that is it. Then, the views that he had on war, that's also very interesting. That also presents Shaw's anti-romantic stance, okay, where he says that, there is have you ever seen a cavalry charge? A cavalry charge is where there will be one man in the front, and then he will be pulling at his horse, waiting for his other friends to come, and they are also very reluctantly coming forward, and then there will be all of these other people who will come together. It is like throwing peas or stones at a window. The first one lands, then two or three, and then the whole set lands together. Okay, and the major injuries will probably be broken knees from the horses clashing together. That's about it. So see, this entire idea of a great cavalry charge, okay, Bluntschli just de-glorified it in an instant. In the very first act, when the Raina comes to know that there has been a cavalry charge, she thinks of it as the great cavalry charge, the Battle of Slivnitza, and so on. And then this man comes and tells her how this entire thing was an accident. They just had the wrong bullets, and then he was looking at this Major Quixote who was flashing his sword like it was the greatest thing he has ever done, whereas he should have been shot dead then and there for it. Understand? So that is it. Okay. And then Sergius comes and talks about how he was censured or scolded by the superior officers for winning the war the wrong way while they were losing it the right way. Understand? So these kind of statements kind of put across the idea that Shaw wants us to have, that war, like anything else, is just a job. Understand? So we should not try to glamorize it, we should not try to glorify it or ascribe a higher purpose to it, because it just doesn't have it. Yes. And also the way in which the facades of these characters drop, okay, that also effectively helps Shaw talk about how not to romanticize or glorify these concepts. Okay, because Raina says, I have never lied in my life, and things like that, and then Bluntschli is like, my dear lady, please don't say these things, please. And then she just breaks down, and she's like, how did you find out that I have been bluffing, and things like that. And just very naturally she just slides into her own true self. And the relief in these characters, okay, is very, very palpable when there is someone who recognizes them for who they are. Understand? That is a very important thing, and we will come to that when we talk about original morality. So anyway, so you have anti-romanticism, you have idealism versus realism. Okay, then you have discussions on class. Okay, so that is why you have Raina talking about how they have a library, and how they have the only two-storied building. Okay, and she says, you needn't have come up the drainage pipe. We have stairs. And Bluntschli just humors me, stairs. And she's like, yes. And she's like, I am a Petkov. And he's like, you are a pet what? And she's like, Petkov. My name is Petkov. And he's like, oh yes, I'm so sorry. That kind of a thing. So and the conversations between Luca and Raina, where Luca is trying to show that she's every bit as capable, as good, as accomplished, and in fact maybe she's better than Raina, because unlike Raina, she is not pretentious. She's not pretending to be one person while deep inside she is someone else. Understand? So that way, Luca feels superior, which means that, class is after all an artificial construct. And Luca is a woman who is trying to break out of the constraints that class has placed upon her. Okay, and I would not go so far as to say that, maybe she liked Sergius because he saw her beyond her class. Okay. Possibly that could actually be a reason why she actually responded to Sergius, because Sergius saw her beyond her class, and not only that, Sergius identified himself with her. Understand? He said that I like you for who you are, for the way in which you talk to me. So the stifling constraints that are placed upon human beings by social norms, understand, that is brought out very effectively here. But the very same Luca is guilty of ascribing class to Nicola when she says that You have the soul of a servant. And then, you have Catherine, who is presented as, wearing all these grand gowns within the house, so that, nobody can understand that she comes from peasant stock. So this class anxiety, the anxiety of class, is very, very much present in this particular play. Understand? And at the end of it all, when Sergius falls in love with Luca, when Bluntschli falls in love with Raina, when the entire play is resolved, and you realize that at the end of the day, everybody is, after all, just human. Understand that these artificial walls that are constructed by things like class have to come down, and the only people who can do this are the people themselves. Okay, nobody is going to come and break down those walls for you. You have to knock down those walls yourself. Understand? Which brings us to the concept of original morality. Understand? So Shaw, what is Shaw exactly trying to do through this play? What is he trying to, convey? Apart from, when he says that war is not so glamorous, that relationships, particularly, things like marriage, is a good idea, that, one should find a kind of an ideological affinity, okay, drop pretensions. What is he trying to do? That is what is meant by trying to follow original morality as opposed to social morality or socially accepted norms. See, who has told us that we have to behave in a certain way, that we have to do these things in a certain fashion? It is society. Okay, so both Henrik Ibsen as well as Shaw. In fact, Shaw was influenced by Rousseau, the French philosopher Rousseau, as well as Henrik Ibsen, who believed that human beings are inherently good. Okay, that all human beings are actually good, but it is the anxiety of following social norms that makes people behave in unpredictable ways. Understand? So if we did not have these constraints that we have now, of gender, of class, of caste, of nationality, things like that, then I think we would be extremely different people. We would behave, talk, sit around, interact in vastly different ways. Okay, so that is the morality that Shaw says we should have. Follow your heart. Understand? Follow the inherent goodness of your heart, and that is all that is needed. So when Sergius, when Raina drop the facade, drop the act, they feel intensely relieved. See, you could never observe Raina happier than when Bluntschli calling her out on her artifice. Okay, telling her that she's pretending, telling her that she's acting. That is when she feels extremely happy. That is when the full force of her personality comes out. Understand? Same is the case with Sergius, who is romantically posing like a hero somewhere, and then he kind of makes a pass at Luca, and Luca calls him out on his pretentiousness, and instantly the curtain drops, and you see that he is a very nice man. He is not the pompous human being you imagine him to be, but the minute he puts on the pretense, he becomes extremely pompous and thoroughly insufferable. Understand? And at the very end of the play, when he says, "Is that a man? What a man?" We understand that this idea of man itself has been turned around on its head. Understand? So where man should have stood for oneself and answering one's soul seems to be the hallmark of not just man but also human. Understand? So it's that overall understanding that comes that he refers to. Okay, so that is the resolution of the play. Understand? So it is that man is not the one who goes on battles bearing arms. Man is the one who is able to follow his original morality, his heart, and do those things that are what we call the right thing. Understand? So what Shaw is asking is that he seeks that people around him do the right thing, okay, than do what is perceived as right or what is perceived as correct by society. Understand? So that is how the play is different, and that is how the play is an anti-romantic comedy in 3 acts. But what comes across as a surprise is when Bluntschli reveals that the paragon of pragmatism that we saw him to be, he turns out to be an extremely romantic man who ran away from home and kind of boarded ships and was being a mercenary, and fighting from place to place to place. Understand? So it means that you just need to follow your heart. You don't have to make a huge ideology out of it. Okay, so what Shaw is asking his characters and asking the general public to understand is that it is beautiful having an ideology that never settles. Understand? That works on the basic principles of humanism, that looks to love without question or expectation. Okay, that manages to keep notions, concepts, and interactions simple. Once that is there, then life becomes beautiful, as happens in the case of Bluntschli himself. Understand? So those are the themes of the play. Are there any other themes that you think might be relevant? No? Yes. Jingoism. Jingoism is this, overt, sorry, Jingoism is this overt support for one's country, the kind of flag waving form of nationalism, fervor, which does not brook any opposition, those grand speeches that people make in the favor of one's nation, which can be rather incendiary, which can incite people to reach the heights of patriotic fervor, I'm sorry, patriotic fervor. That is what is jingoism, where you probably mix a bit of fact and fiction and glamour and, kind of make it out to be much more than what it is. It's a nationalistic narrative. Okay? So any other thematic concerns that you might have spotted and you would like to point out? Tell me yes or no. Heroism, you can link it with idealism, where, like I said, the way that, he talks about the great cavalry charge at Slivnitsa, the contrast between the way that, Raina hears about it and the way that Bluntschli talks about it, both of these things is a classic example. And not only that, who exactly is a hero? Who exactly is a hero also comes to the forefront in this idealism versus realism conversation. Plus, like I told you, in the scope of anti-romanticism, that also it comes. Equality in different classes we already talked about as a theme. Class was a theme. I said idealism versus romanticism or realism, then anti-romanticism, class, original morality. Okay. So hypocrisy will also come under original morality.
Ma'am, when Luca actually says that she's as equal as Raina in every way, so that's what I meant. The servants actually.
That we had already spoken about. See that those class constraints that have been placed upon Luca, she tries to come out of that by defying Raina.
Okay, ma'am.
Youth versus maturity, not really, because all of them are more or less of the same age. In fact, Bluntschli seems to be rather silly when he estimates Raina to be some 16 years or something like that. So,
Ma'am, there's also this.
Ma'am,
okay, wait. Wait, let Rima finish. What is it?
Yeah, ma'am. The thing about feminine sentimentalism in the play, like where women are considered soft at heart. But then, is that true? Because there is Luca, who shows no symbols of civility in front of Catherine nor Raina.
And then, you also have, Raina herself, who manages to, fool the soldiers who come into her room. Okay. And, there is Catherine, who is a very, very practical individual. So, they run around all the situations. And not only that, the way that, Catherine jumps from one prospective son-in-law to the other. So it's not about just female sentimentality. It is about the sentimental, let's say, outlook that people have towards war in general, war and love that Shaw tries to dismantle. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah, Abhijit.
okay, ma'am. At the end of the story, Sergius says, "What a man is he a man?" So, ma'am, what's the meaning, real meaning? I didn't understand that.
That
What
is
does he
what I
mean
was
by that?
telling you in terms of, this whole idea of masculinity, as well as, what constitutes humanity. Understand? See, till now, Sergius would have been considered the epitome of masculinity because, he was handsome, he had that wonderful nose, he had that reputation of being a wonderful warrior. Understand? But, towards the end of the play, we understand that those are not the things that one has to value in a human being or in a man for that matter. Okay. With the passage of time, the kind of morality that one shows, the compassion, the understanding, the way in which, human beings negotiate their realities as well as the realities of others, by speaking plainly, by speaking openly and clearly. Understand? Now that is what would distinguish a man. Okay, so here Shaw does not just point to the the breaking down of the idea or the ideal of masculinity. He also tries to establish a new kind of human being. Understand? One who is compassionate, one who is intelligent, one who does not indulge in sword waving or, a reckless endangerment of one's life just for the sake of glamour. Okay, so see, at the beginning of the play, Sergius was supposed to be the ideal man. But by the time the play ends, it is, Bluntschli who is the ideal man. That is why he makes that comment. Like I told you, you should contrast that with what we read yesterday, day before yesterday, with, Calpurnia talking about, the death of princes, causing cataclysms, the way that, Caesar talks about himself, when he says that, cowards die 100 deaths, but the brave die but once. Understand? So those were the ideals, those were the celebrated concepts of masculinity, of human nature at one point of time. But Shaw is asking us to imagine beyond that. What Shaw is asking us to do is to celebrate a man who is human, okay, who is compassionate, who is good, who has inherent goodness, who does not fall for the pretensions or the artifice of the notions set out by society. Okay, who makes his own rules, and they are rules that are kind, that encourage coexistence rather than needless sword waving. Is that clear now?
Yes, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Incompetent authority. Yeah, again, that will come under this whole idea of deglamorizing war. Okay, because, you have, Bluntschli's superiors who did not bring in the right kind of guns and bullets. You have, the Russian generals who were losing the war the wrong way. Okay, and you have people like Petkov who don't know what to do with their horses and what to do with the prisoners of war and so on. So you should understand. That's why I said what Shaw is trying to show is that war is like any other job. Okay, there will always be people who are good at it. There will always be people who are bad at it. There is no need to link it to a higher ideal. There's no need to celebrate it. Is what Shaw is trying to say. Okay. So is there any other theme that you would like me to talk about that we haven't talked about? That you think should be spoken about? Now let's just take a look at the characters in quick succession. Honesty. What sort of honesty?
Ma'am, Bluntschli is honest to say that he always carries chocolate with him rather than ammunition.
Okay, yeah, sure. We could consider honesty as a theme, because I thought, we had discussed that also, in the sense that the way that, these pretensions can drop. Okay, the sense of relief that one feels. I would put all of this under the idea of original morality. Understand this, or the sensibilities of honesty, or the sense of freedom that one feels when all that facade, all that artifice just drops. I think that will also come under original morality. So what you can do is that if the themes are asked, you write these 4 themes and then proceed to explain all of these things as sub themes. That would be a better idea. Okay. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am.
Please.
All right. Fine. So, in terms of characters, you have a set of lovers, and at the end, they all get exchanged. Okay. So, before we go to the characters, let me just tell you that the comedy that is presented in, or the humor that is presented in Arms and the Man is basically situational and linguistic humor. Okay, it is situational and linguistic humor, because sometimes with the whole game about the chocolate cream soldier and a picture of Raina in it, the coat, that is a case of situational humor or comedy. Then where the major comes in, and then Petkov comes in, and then so does Bluntschli more or less at the same time, and then how these people are trying to hide him and send him away quietly. That is an example of situational humor. And linguistic humor and situational humor come together sometimes, where in the first scene, act, what happens is Bluntschli is hiding behind the curtain, and then he suddenly comes out, puts his head out and says, "Remember, dear lady." And, this one says, "Yes, what is it?" The soldiers are at the door. And he says, 9 out of 10 soldiers are fools. And she makes a face at him, and then he goes back inside. So these things keep the play grounded in reality. Okay, they make them easily identifiable, these characters, these let's say situations. Now, as far as the play is concerned, we are introduced to Raina, okay, who comes across as a rather spoiled, selfish, overtly idealistic young woman. Okay, but because Shaw believes in the inherent goodness of all human beings, she then reveals her true self as a rather sensitive and a rather sprightly kind of an individual who falls for the calm collectedness of Bluntschli. Understand? And there is something very innocent about her, as she has been engaged to Sergius, but somehow the sight of this bedraggled man who climbs up her drain pipe kind of moves her. Understand? And she finds that the way he talked about all of this, it appealed to her inner sensibility. That is why in just she puts that very interesting note in his pocket. So Raina, I wouldn't say that Raina's character undergoes a transformation. Nobody in this play, none of the characters in the play have a transformed characters by the end of the play. Their characters do not undergo a transformation. What happens exactly is that they just reveal their true selves. Understand? So that is something that you have to keep in mind. These characters only reveal their true selves because they then are tired of pretending. Okay, so the pretensions come away and they reveal their true self. Okay, then you have Luca, whose character has infinitely more shades of complexity, who's struggling against the destiny that has been ascribed to her by her class. Okay, Nicola talks about how he transformed her from a country bumpkin into this sophisticated servant lady who can wait upon the noblest of people in the best of households, and how he has molded her to handle a shop all on her own, and how he has been grooming her for a certain role in life. Understand? But what Luca does is that she applies her native intelligence to her situation and tries to behave with people as equals. Okay, so she is striving for a social realism which goes beyond the understanding of characters such as Raina and Catherine. Understand? It is only Major Petkoff who treats her with absent-minded kindness, because that is how Major Petkoff is with everybody. Okay, so Luca, that is why I said Luca's character has that kind of complexity, which is why she is openly defiant also towards Sergius. See, somehow her mind is so sharp that she can make out the kind of dilemma that Sergius faces. That's why she has that conversation with him about how many different Sergiuses there are. Okay, so that is why, and she has a very, very clear understanding of people's characters. She is kind of a nice sort of Cassius. Please don't write that. Okay, so that's why she tells Sergius, if that soldier who was there that night comes back, then Miss Raina will surely marry him. And that's exactly what happens also. Understand? So, and she does not drop Luca just because she is going to marry Sergius. She does so because she has reached breaking point. She has seen that Miss Raina has given her an example without meaning to, of how to follow one's own heart. And all this time, probably Luca herself was being led to believe that, this is all that life can present for her. That, she is set to marry this Nicola, and, be running a shop somewhere and, have that kind of servitude. But, when she sees that, a woman like Raina is falling for a man like Blunchley, she thinks that, possibly life can have blurred lines, that these lines don't have to be set in iron, that I can cross these lines too. If Miss Raina can, so can I. Understand? So this, shows that Luca is a woman of great enterprise and bravery, actually. Okay, because being a peasant girl with absolutely no means to fall back upon, she has decided to take this very bold step. So that is about Luca. Is there anything you would like to add about Luca? Some aspect that you have found? You can say yes or no, one of these two things.
No, ma'am.
Okay. Do you agree with all of this, or do you disagree with something? Oh, I said everything. Okay, thank you. Opportunist. Why would you call her an opportunist, Akhila?
Ma'am, when she's saying that she knows the secrets of secrets about Raina.
See that? Yeah. Please continue. Sorry.
No, ma'am, you can continue.
Okay,
I think she's insincere and opportunist. A contrast to Nicola's character.
Contrast. Okay, see, the thing is that actually that's not how it is, because knowledge is power. Understand? Knowledge is power, and that is something that Luca has learned very early. Understand? So she wants to know things so that she can use them. Okay, and for a person like Luca, power is everything because she has been rendered powerless all her life. All her life, she has been controlled by somebody or the other. Like I told you, she was just a peasant girl in some distant farm somewhere. She had a tough time there. Here she comes, and here Nicola is trying to control her. All of these other people are ordering her about, and there is the spirit of independence within her that is rebelling against this form of oppression, because she sees two legs, two arms, two eyes, one nose on everybody. Then she wonders, why should I be treated so badly as a servant? Okay, so she uses her knowledge to negotiate her power, to establish a relationship of power between herself and Sergius, between herself and Nicola. See, that is why Nicola says, do you really imagine that after working all these years in this house, I don't know the kind of secrets that can break this house up immediately, but I keep quiet. Understand? So what Luca tries to accomplish by revealing, Nicola manages to accomplish by keeping quiet. See, that is the difference. Understand? So she's not an evil or an opportunistic character. She just uses information as power. That is why. Anyway, thank you for that point, because then we were able to mention this. Yes, she does like to learn. She likes to know about things. Understand? It's not learning in the academic sense of the term. It is learning in terms of gathering information. That is very, very important for her. Okay. So now then, shall we move on to Sergius? See, like Raina, Sergius also is not one of those well thrashed out characters. Okay, he's not one of those well defined characters, because he has been presented there as an antithesis or as a contrast to Bluntschli, just as Raina is a contrast to both Bluntschli as well as Luca, actually speaking. Okay, so they are basically kept there as contrasts, and Sergius seems to present that sense of immovability, that sense of lack of flexibility, which we consider to be glamorous, which we consider to be ideal. So Sergius is placed there as an example of what sort of ideal man to not be. Understand? So he is blind to his own faults. He is extremely egotistic. But at the same time, you have to understand that he is probably behaving in this fashion because that is what society expects of him. That is what society thinks he should behave like. Understand? So that is why, he kind of challenges Bluntschli to a duel when he understands that, Raina and he have feelings for each other. Understand? And that is why Bluntschli just knocks the entire challenge out of the path. Okay. So he is an extremely attractive person. But the thing is that, he hasn't actually dropped that pompousness even at the end. Okay. So that's why I said nobody undergoes a transformation. They just show their actual selves. So see, that is why, he says, I am going to marry Luca, and anybody who will, oppose me, I will pay them if they will spit in my face, if I order soldiers about. See, he makes all those grand statements all the time. Because that is the socially accepted convention, that's a socially accepted impression about Sergius. Understand? So he's in a way, both Raina and Sergius are acting a part that has been scripted for them by society. A beautiful girl must be very delicate, and she must have ideals, and she must fall in love with a hero. A hero must be wonderful, must be idealistic, unbending, uncompromising, and thoroughly in love with a wonderfully spiritually accomplished lady. See, but both of them What do they actually like? They like the salt of the earth. Understand? They like hardcore realists. They like people who are made of flesh and blood. There you go. Okay, so that's the whole crux of this entire thing. They both are playing parts that have been scripted for them by society. Okay, yes. And then you have Nicola, okay, who is an opportunist. Okay, I would call Nicola an opportunist because, see, when he may have in some way or in whatever way he knows, he might have loved, what is her name, Luca. Okay, but this love actually is qualified by or is based on or founded upon the economic gain that Luca would bring him. Understand? The economic gain that Luca would bring Nicola. So that is why he kind of grooms her. That is why, he kind of sets up that employment for her, and then, constantly, in fact, has gone and told Major Petkov that he was engaged to Luca, and, he he gets money from him. Understand? And he is a man who is working towards one single dream all the time. That is to have that shop in the capital, in Sofia. Understand? So he wants that shop, and that's all that he cares about. That is why immediately, when he comes to know that Sergius has a thing for her, he tells her, you please go, and then you come back and buy things from only my shop. Understand? So that's all he is. So probably, Nicola is also a victim of the kind of impact that class as well as its discrimination has on the soul of a person. Understand? Even when Luca says you have the soul of a servant, she does not, point out the fact that Nicola is a highly intelligent person who uses silence as a tool of negotiating power. Understand? So for both Nicola and for Luca, knowledge is power. But while, Luca tries to vocalize her knowledge in exchange for power, Nicola keeps quiet about his knowledge so that he can negotiate power. Understand? So yeah, in the end, that is why this characteristic of Nicola is recognized by Bluntschli, is why he offers him a job in his establishment. Okay, so that's why I think that, that way, this play, I think the one man who has made a huge success out of this play, the character is actually Nicola, because ultimately, Bluntschli, Sergius, Luca, Raina, they have all just got what they wanted. But Nicola has got more than what he bargained for. Okay, so that is a very interesting thing. Right. And anybody else we should be discussing? Major Petkov?
Ma'am,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Was it possible, like in the real conditions, like in the timeline of the play, was it really possible for a girl like Luca to marry a man like Sergius?
No,
It wasn't.
it wasn't. It wasn't at all, actually. But this was the kind of aspiration that was often, presented in all of these novels and so on. I mean, think of those novels way back there in, written by, the novel Pamela, the very first one. Yeah, where there is this girl who is pursued by her master, and, he can't get her to sleep with him, so he offers to marry him. Novels like that. You have Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, a woman who is constantly oppressed on account of her state of powerlessness. Okay, so it would not have been possible at all, particularly in a place like Europe, which was so, hinged upon class and so on. It would have been difficult. Okay, but maybe by the time it was the 1930s, 40s, and so on, it was slightly more possible. But definitely not in these places like Eastern Europe.
Yeah,
And
also, sorry, ma'am. I also read somewhere that Shaw was prophesizing, in a way, was prophesizing the First World War.
Yes, that was what I was going to. Yeah, you continue. You were saying something.
No, that's it, man. That's it.
Okay, because I wanted to mention this earlier. The background of the play, the war between Serbia and Bulgaria. Now it is a reference to the war that broke out in 1885 between Serbia and Bulgaria. Understand? And the events that unfolded throughout these wars was what finally culminated in the First World War. So yes, he was kind of predicting that there will be a bigger war, a greater war coming. And when you look at the way that the First World War came about, and also the way that ideologies and huge national narratives came crumbling down, you realize that Shaw was absolutely on the mark, because as they say in the play, in the 1885 war, what happened was that the Bulgarians were being supported by the Russians, and the Serbians were being supported by the Austro-Hungarians. And then what happens is that Russia withdraws her generals, and Bulgaria from Bulgaria, and then of course the outcome of the war, etc., is the same as what is being said there. While all that is true, you realize that in the First World War there was a great deal of shock that the world experienced. Understand? Because where all of Europe thought itself to be the center of civilization, where it thought itself to be the height of civilization, and they were the Renaissance people, they gave light and knowledge to all of the world and so on. The kind of devastation, the kind of cruelty, the kind of loss that they witnessed on their continent made them understand that there was a need to take a very long and hard look at themselves. Understand? In fact, the Russian Revolution, one of the catalysts of the Russian Revolution was the First World War. Understand? Which the Russian Revolution, October Revolution, that took place in 1919. You will come to it. Excuse me. You will come to it in Animal Farm. We will be discussing it. I suppose, or whether you have already discussed it, I don't know. So when that happens, it will be Russia. Actually, the monarchy in Russia began to dodder and shake because of the First World War and the kind of loss and tragedy that was precipitated. In fact, T.S. Eliot's landmark work, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1921, was a work called *The Wasteland*. Understand? You have poets writing, "In the dark of the night, all the dogs of Europe bark." Okay, so all of that came from the trauma of seeing what could happen. Like she said, they didn't expect it to be so violent. They did not expect their inner instincts to be so base and violent. And then to completely finish off any conception that they had about their own civilization, came the Second World War with its untold misery, death count, sophistication of weapons, devastation, the cultural impact, so on and so forth. Understand? So when that happened, it completely broke the spine of Europe as far as the cultural thing was concerned. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Anything else?
You also asked us to remind you about the sudden surprise that we find in Blonsky's character.
I told you that. Where we found him to be the most pragmatic of human beings, and then he
Yes,
turns
ma'am.
out to be.
Sorry.
Okay. Then, anything else? So, what are your impressions about the play? Vani, I'm going to pick and choose now.
Hello.
Tell me, Vani.
Ma'am, by use
We'll stop the recording now.